Thank you for tuning in to Terry Swoop Videos. Make sure to turn on the notification bell for future videos. On today's video, I'm going to talk about the life and death of the legendary R&B singer Luther Vandross. I believe Luther Vandross is the greatest R&B vocalist of all time. This man's voice was amazing. He couldn't just sing, he could sing. And my mother was the biggest Luther Vandross fan on the face of the earth. She would play Luther Vandross music all day, every day. And when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, I actually got tired of listening to Luther Vandross music because my mother would play his songs all day long. And I know all the words to every song. I know the words to every song because she would play it so much. Luther Vandross's fans were primarily black women. They were his most loyal fans. He would put out a record, it would sell millions of copies within months. And he was one of the highest selling R&B singers of the 80s. Luther shares the same birthday as my mother. He was born on April 20th, 1951 in Manhattan, New York. Born in a two-parent household. His mother was a nurse and his father was a singer. He was a local singer in the Manhattan area. But his father died of diabetes when he was 8 years old, and he was primarily raised by his single mother. And he started singing at an early age. He put together the group Shades of Jade, and they were also called Listen My Brother. They changed their name numerous times, but he was the leader of this R&B group at 17 years old. And they started singing together in 1969 and appearing together on the first episode of Sesame Street in 1969.
To get to Sesame Street.
We were the first group on Sesame Street, the very first day that it was on the air in October of 1969.
What's going on around here?
We're gonna start from the head, going down to the feet, and the parts of the body right on the beat.
And that was a big coup for all of us. You know, it was our TV debut.
Ears, eyes.
We had no idea that Sesame Street would turn out to be what it ended up being. We didn't know. All we knew that there was a chance to be on TV. And we were wondering, well, why are we singing songs about count to 20?
We're only halfway, so here we go again. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17.
When Luther appeared on Sesame Street, he had no idea it would go on to be one of the most popular kids shows of all time. And the popularity of being on the show actually gave him more notoriety within the music industry. David Bowie asked him to sing tracks on some of his songs. Once Luther started working with David Bowie, who was one of the biggest singers in the industry at the time, other singers in the industry started recognizing him. So he started working with Bette Midler. He sung backgrounds at her concerts. He started working with Roberta Flack. He sung backgrounds on her songs. And that's when he started to become a big name within the industry.
You've done jingles, I know you've done commercials, and you did a lot of background work before it was Luther.
Right.
It was just out there in front. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, for me, everything began. David Bowie accidentally heard me singing in a studio, and I was a kid, you know, and I always had vocal ideas. I always had background vocal ideas. Even in the projects, when we had my little group together, I was the one that gave out all the parts and all the harmonies and stuff, you know. And so I was in the studio visiting Carlos Alomar, who I went to school with, who had gotten the gig playing with Bowie. And I'm listening to the music, and I say to one of our friends, I said, you know, it sounds good. I said, but it needs like a hook phrase or something. I said, because, you know, it doesn't have any like hook phrase. And I started singing, the name of the album was Young Americans. And I started singing, it needs something like Young Americans, Young Americans. And Bowie, I didn't know he was sitting there listening to this whole thing. And he stood up, who are you, blah, blah, blah. And so he took me on the road with him. And that was the way things began. He introduced me to Bette Midler. Bette took me on the road with her. I was the, you know, Bette has the background series, the 3 called the Harlots. I've known I was the 4th harlot for years, because I used to sit behind the curtain.
You were a harlot.
I used to sit behind the curtain and sing, with my microphone stand and music and everything. And for years I toured with Bet, and then Bet introduced me to a producer which you all probably know named Arif Martin. Arif Martin, who produced Chaka Khan and Ringo Starr and Carly Simon and all of those artists. And that's how everything got started. From then it was just connecting all the rest of the dots.
In June of 1981, Luther released his debut album, Never Too Much, with Epic Records. The album debuted in the top 10. It sold 3 million copies in the US and 5 million copies worldwide. This album automatically made Luther Vandross an international star. And he developed a loyal fan base with middle-aged black women. 80% of his record sales came from black women. And he sold a lot of records because of this. He released 10 albums throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And every album sold platinum or better. So he had a loyal fan base with black women, and a lot of white women loved his music as well. But because most of his fans were women, and he sung about love songs dedicated to them, they had no idea that he was gay. They had no idea that he was hiding his sexuality. And this is one of the reasons why he never came out about his sexuality. At the time, George Michael also hid his sexuality. And being gay in the industry was completely different back then than it is now. Today, it's perfectly acceptable to be gay in the music industry. But 30 years ago, it wasn't as acceptable back then as it is now. Patti LaBelle was Luther Vandross's best friend. She knew everything about him. He told her his most intimate details about his life. And he said the reason why he didn't come out about his sexuality because he didn't want to upset his fans. Most of his fans were women. Most of his fans were in love with him. So if he would have came out back then, it would have hurt his career and it would have upset his fans.
Did he struggle with the idea of coming out publicly? Was that something that you talked about at all?
We talked about it. It was basically he did not want his mother to be, although she might have known, but he wasn't going to come out and say this to the world. And he had a lot of lady fans, and he told me that he just didn't want to upset the world.
Little Richard was the king of rock and roll, the architect of rock and roll. And he was secretly a gay man. He said he hid his sexuality because he was afraid it would hurt his career. And Luther Vandross did the same thing. George Michael did the same thing. Numerous singers in the music industry did this during the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s. It wasn't until the 90s that you started seeing more singers come out and be honest about their sexuality. Because in today's modern day era, it's much more acceptable to be gay. People don't make a big deal about it anymore. But back then, 30, 40 years ago, we lived in a homophobic society. If any person was even speculated of being gay, it would hurt their career. So I can fully understand why Luther Vandross hid his sexuality. In the 1970s, Elton John literally married a woman just so he could hide his sexuality. This man literally married a woman just so he could hide his sexuality. Elton John didn't start coming out until the 80s, but during the 60s and 70s, he hid his sexuality. So I can fully understand why Luther Vandross was in fear of coming out about his sexuality. Now I'm going to talk about the problems with Luther's weight. Now, I'm a person that's had problems with my weight my entire life. I've always struggled with my weight. So I can understand what Luther was going through with his weight. He would gain weight, he would lose weight, and I've been this same way my whole life. I gain 100 pounds, I lose 100 pounds. 1 year, I'm 150, the next year, I'm 250. And he did this for 20 years. He would gain 100 pounds and he would lose 100 pounds. 1 year he's thin, the next year he's overweight. And when you get in your 40s, this can be very detrimental to your health.
The first year of the Soul Train Music Awards, the premiere show of Don's idea, he got Dionne Warwick and myself to co-host. Went great.
He was at his svelte, thin part of his life. And the following year, we were to host it again.
And about 3 weeks before the show was due to be taped, I called up Dion. I said, you know what? I can't do Soul Train, the second one. I can't do this. I can't do it.
So I went by his home. I said, what's the problem? I mean, it's something that apparently we can fix. Look at me, look at me. I said, I'm looking at you. But, I mean, I look like the Goodyear blimp. All you gotta do is write Goodyear across my butt and fly me. I said, Luther, I said, are you crazy?
I can't face the curtain opening and them saying, ladies and gentlemen, to host the 2nd annual Soul Train Music Awards, Dionne Warwick and Luther Vandross, and the curtain opens, and I'm 90 pounds heavier than I was the previous year.
And he had the tape on from last year. And of course, you know, that plays tricks with the head. Look at me, and now look at me. That doesn't matter. People love Luther. They don't care if you're heavy, or if you're thin, or if you're in between. They care about you.
You know, she tried to talk me out of it, and I was just too mortified.
It's over now.
And I was at my biggest weight. And across the hall walked one of the waiters. And I said, see, Whitney, I said, that's the size I want to get down to. And she said, why? I said, well, I said, look at, you know, I said, he has a 34 waist, he's my height, you know, it's just right, you know. She said, yeah, but Luther, he can't sing. And I said, yeah, but look at how the jacket falls. And, you know, that's how the designer meant for it to happen, you know, and how everything just falls. She said, yeah, but Luther, he can't sing, you know. And that message just, you know, that message resonates, you know, throughout my life.
Dionne Warwick was absolutely right. The fans didn't care about Luther's weight. They didn't care whether he was fat or thin. They loved Luther Vandross. People loved his music regardless of whether he was thin or fat. He was being self-conscious about his weight for no reason, because the fans would have supported him no matter what. That's how great of an artist he was. Now, if you look at a lot of these music artists, if they were to gain weight, they would lose their fan base. Hypothetically, if Justin Bieber were to gain 200 pounds, he would lose his entire fan base. All these teenage girls who love Justin Bieber would no longer be supporting him. It would no longer be going to his concert, because part of his appeal is his image. The same thing with Chris Brown. If Chris Brown were to gain 200 pounds, he would lose his entire fan base. No one would be going to Chris Brown's concerts if he was 400 pounds, because part of Chris Brown's appeal is his sex appeal. But Luther Vandross was such a great singer. He was such a great performer. No one cared whether he was overweight or not. No one cared whether he was thin or fat. That's how much a great singer Luther Vandross was. On April 16, 2003, Luther Vandross suffered a severe stroke. He was in a coma for nearly 2 months, but he eventually recovered. But he lost his ability to walk, and he lost his ability to sing. But he could still speak. And over the next 2 years, he tried to recover, but eventually he died in 2005, right before the release of his last album, Dance with My Father. His last album was released in October of 2005, and the album sold 3 million copies. A lot of fans showed up and supported him and bought his last album. And I thought that last album, Dance with My Father, was one of his greatest albums of his career. And this man will go down in history as one of the greatest singers of all time. If you are a fan of Luther Vandross, tell me your opinion in the comments section. If you enjoyed this video, share it on Facebook and Twitter. A lot of people have different opinions about this topic. Leave a comment, rate, and subscribe.